Well, hello and welcome back. I am your host, Julia, holistic therapist and storyteller. This is a space for thoughtful conversations about mental health, relationships, personal growth, and the powerful connection between the nervous system and emotional healing, integrating the mind, body, and spirit. Each episode offers grounded insight, practical tools, and reflective dialogue to support sustainable embodied change. Gentle reminder before we begin, this podcast is for education and self help. It is certainly not a substitute for professional therapy, counseling, or medical advice. As every journey is so unique, explore what feels supportive for you. And if you are in any distress, please reach out to a qualified mental health professional in your area. You are not alone. So before we begin, let's take a moment to arrive into this space and join the present moment. Perhaps take a moment to unclench your jaw. Maybe take a breath in and let your shoulders soften as you exhale. And just notice your surroundings. So often we move through our days chasing a feeling that we call happiness. We imagine it waiting somewhere ahead of us. And perhaps we carry this quiet belief that somehow, someday, we'll finally feel happy when. Maybe when work isn't so overwhelming, when the kids get a little older, maybe when we finish the project we've been working on, or when that next vacation finally arrives, or even when life feels a little less busy. But the truth is, rarely life unfolds that way. Oftentimes the list clears, and then it fills again. One challenge resolves, and then another appears. And before we know it, the calm moment we are waiting for has somehow moved a little further ahead into the future. So if happiness depends on arriving there, we might spend much of our lives postponing it. Today I want to explore this idea, what I think of as a happiness myth. So settle in and let's begin. Psychologists have actually studied this habit we have of placing happiness somewhere in the future. A Harvard researcher named Daniel Gilbert spent years exploring why the mind is so convinced that later will feel better than right now. His work focuses on something called effective forecasting. This is our attempt to predict how future events will make us feel. And interestingly, humans are not very good at it. We tend to imagine that certain moments will finally bring that feeling that we've been waiting for. Perhaps it's that new promotion, when we purchase a new home, or a long-awaited chapter beginning. And yes, those moments can absolutely bring feelings of joy and happiness. But as Gilbert's research suggests, something many of us quietly begin to notice afterwards is that we tend to overestimate how long that feeling will stay with us. We imagine the milestone arriving and the feeling lingering there, as if happiness will finally take up residence in our lives. But more often, the moment arrives, the feeling peaks, and then slowly it softens and life returns as normal. Psychologists call this hedonic adaptation. It's a nervous system remarkable ability to adjust and return to kind of an emotional baseline over time. In many ways, this is actually one of our greatest survival strengths. After loss, after difficulty, and through the quiet passing of time, we somehow find our way back to equilibrium. But that same adaptation works in the other direction too. That new job becomes routine. The new home becomes just a home. And the extraordinary slowly transitions back into ordinary moments. And without really noticing it, the mind begins scanning the horizon again. What next? What would make this feeling complete for me? What might finally make this feel like enough? There was even a well-known study that compared lottery winners with people who had experienced serious accidents. Research expected their long-term happiness levels to look dramatically different. But over time, something surprising happened. Both groups gradually moved back towards something close to their previous levels of well-being. Not identical, not unchanged, but far closer than anyone would have predicted. Which tells us something important about being human. We keep reaching, hoping the next arrival will finally be the one that feels like enough. Think about a time when you worked towards something, you really worked towards it, and when it finally arrived, it felt amazing. But then, almost without even noticing, life simply continued. The feeling softened, and the moment folded back into ordinary rhythm of your days, not because a moment wasn't meaningful at the time, but because many emotions are designed to move. Neuroanatomist Dr. Jill Bolt-Taylor often referred to this as a 90-second rule. When something triggers an emotional reaction within us, the brain releases a burst of stress chemicals into the body. We feel it as a physical wave, the quickening heartbeat, the tightening in the chest, the warmth rising in the skin. But that biological surge is actually very short-lived, often less than 90 seconds. And after that, the body naturally is ready to return to balance. What often keeps those emotions going beyond that isn't usually the body, it's our mind. It's our mind replaying the story, analyzing what happened, or imagining what might happen next. And each time that we return to that story, the wave begins again, and we find ourselves caught in something the body was already ready to let go of. And somehow I find something quietly freeing in that notion. Because if emotions are designed to move, then holding on to happiness or other feelings in general is like trying to hold a wave in your hands. It arrives, but it moves through you, and eventually it dissolves. Not as a failure of the moment, but as a natural rhythm of feeling, of being human. And when we expect happiness to stay, we often mistake its fading as some sort of loss, as if something has slipped away. And maybe we even internalize that as something wrong within ourselves. But nothing has gone wrong. The emotional system is simply doing what it's always meant to do. So perhaps a happiness myth isn't that happiness exists. We know it does. But it's that we believe that it should stay. And when we loosen that expectation, we begin to experience joy differently, not as something to hold on to, but as something to receive while it moves through us. And maybe that's where the real shift begins. Because happiness may have less to do with our circumstances and more to do with where our attention goes. The philosopher Simon Weil once wrote that the quality of our attention is a quality of our life. Not our achievements, not our possessions, not even our circumstances, but our attention. And interestingly, modern psychology has also found evidence that supports this idea. In one well-known study, researchers discovered that people's minds wander nearly half of the time. But the most striking finding wasn't just about how often our attention drifts, it was what happens when it does. So when people's minds were wandering, they reported lower levels of happiness, regardless of what they were doing in those moments, which suggests something simple but profound. So happiness isn't only about what we're doing, but it's actually about whether we're present for it. Most of us recognize this in our own lives. We may be sitting with someone we care about, but part of our mind is already moving on to the next task. Or we may be walking outside on a beautiful day and we barely notice our surroundings as we're mentally replaying something that happened yesterday or worrying about something that hasn't even happened yet. So our bodies are here, but our attention is somewhere else. And when attention leaves the present moment, happiness often leaves with it, not because something is wrong in our lives, but because we're not fully inhabiting them. Which brings us to a deeper question. If happiness fades even after the moments we work so hard to reach, if emotions rise and fall like waves, and if the mind keeps searching for what comes next, then what does it actually mean to live well and be happy? One perspective comes from philosophy. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche described an idea called amor fati. It translates loosely as the love of one's fate. So, not simply accepting what happens in life, but learning to relate to it differently. The idea that well being may not come from controlling life's circumstances, but from how we meet them. Amor Fati invites us to see life not as something that must constantly be improved before we can appreciate it, but as something we can fully participate in, even when it's difficult, even when it's uncertain. The goal isn't to eliminate struggle or discomfort. The goal is to become someone who can meet life as it unfolds naturally. The ordinary days, the responsibilities, the unexpected turns. Not because they're always pleasant, but because they are a natural part of the life that we're actually living. And interestingly, modern psychology echoes something very similar. Research on psychological flexibility, particularly in the acceptance and commitment therapy realm, shows that people tend to experience greater well being not when they eliminate difficult emotions, but when they learn how to move forward in meaningful ways, even when those emotions are present. And as we learned earlier, emotions have a very short shelf life. And along those lines, something else to consider came from the psychologist and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl. He wrote about this concept many decades ago and even built his entire practice around logotherapy. This idea suggesting that the deepest human drive is not pleasure, but meaning. Frankl noticed that people often chase happiness directly. But in his view, happiness rarely appears that way. Instead, it tends to emerge as a byproduct of living a meaningful life. Frankl quoted that happiness cannot be pursued. It must ensue. It must ensue as the unintended side effect of one's dedication to a cause greater than oneself. In other words, happiness is rarely something we achieve by trying to feel happy. It often appears when we're engaged in something that really matters to us, whether that be caring for someone, working toward a goal, creating something meaningful, or standing for values that give our lives direction. People who experience their lives as purposeful and meaningful tend to report deeper and more stable well-being than those that merely focus on pleasure or comfort. Meaning doesn't always feel easy. It often includes effort, responsibility, and even discomfort. But it also gives our lives direction, a sense that we're doing something that matters. Which brings us back to the question we started with. Perhaps a goal isn't to eliminate discomfort or chase happiness as a permanent emotional state, but to engage with life in a way that feels meaningful. Because when we begin to understand this, something important becomes clearer. Living a meaningful life doesn't mean we will feel happy all of the time. Even when our lives are full of purpose and connection, the mind can still drift towards worry, stress, or dissatisfaction. And a part of the reason for that lives deep in how our brains have evolved. So if it sometimes feels like happiness keeps slipping just out of reach, you're not imagining it. Our nervous system wasn't designed to maintain constant happiness. It was designed for survival. It was designed to notice problems and to anticipate what might go wrong. Psychologists call this a negativity bias. It simply means that our mind naturally pays more attention to the potential threats than to what is going well. And thousands of years ago, this was incredibly useful. The people who survived were the ones who noticed the danger, the rustling in the bushes, that unfamiliar sound, the subtle sign that something might be wrong. So the brain became very good at scanning for problems, which means the mind is often quicker to notice what's wrong than to rest in what's already going well for us. But this doesn't mean something is wrong with us. It simply means the brain is doing what it's designed to do, keeping us alert, keeping us cautious, keeping us alive. The challenge is that this ancient survival system is now operating in modern life. And sometimes it creates a feeling that happiness is always just beyond our reach. Because even when things are going well, the mind is already searching for the next problem to solve. But the brain isn't only wired to scan for danger. It also has another powerful system at play that runs quietly in the background, one that pulls us towards reward, motivation, and the pursuit of things that feel good. Which brings us to another important part of the happiness puzzle. In modern culture, happiness is often associated with dopamine, the brain chemical linked to reward and motivation. But dopamine doesn't actually create lasting happiness. It works more like a motivation signal, a small surge that nudges us towards the next rewarding experience, the next goal, the next improvement, the next thing that might feel good. Which is why quick dopamine hits, like scrolling on social media, checking notifications, buying something new, can often feel very exciting in the moment. But if you pay attention, the feeling often fades very quickly. Psychologists sometimes refer to this pattern as reward chasing, and it can leave people feeling strangely empty, even while constantly stimulating their brains with new experiences. Because pleasure and meaning, as we were talking about earlier, are not the same thing. There is another layer to this story. This tendency isn't only shaped by our brains, it's also reinforced by the culture around us. For the past few decades, happiness has increasingly been framed as something we should actively pursue, something we can optimize, improve, even purchase. New routines, new products, new habits. The next book course or strategy promising to unlock the lasting key to happiness. Sociologist William Davies explores this idea in his book, The Happiness Industry. He suggests that modern culture has begun to treat happiness almost like a measurable product, something we should constantly track, improve, or maximize. Because when happiness becomes something we're expected to achieve and maintain all the time, it can quietly reinforce the very myth that we've been exploring today. Because it suggests that if we aren't feeling happy, then something must be wrong with us. Something must need fixing. Perhaps another habit to adopt, another strategy to try. But yet when we step back and we look at the psychology and the neuroscience of being human, we begin to see something very different from the story we're often told about happiness. And as we've explored today, emotions are not designed to stay in one place. They move, and our attention constantly drifts between the past and the future. The brain itself is wired to scan for problems, and it's wired to anticipate what might go wrong. At the same time, that other system is pulling us towards reward, novelty, and the next experiences that promise us to feel good. This modern culture often amplifies the pull, encouraging us to optimize and pursue happiness as if it's something we could finally secure in our lives. So if all this is true, if happiness isn't something we can permanently secure through circumstances, then a very natural question arises. How do we actually live with this? Not as a theory, but in the middle of an ordinary life. One place to begin is with mindful attention, because as we explored earlier, the quality of our attention shapes the quality of our experience, which means sometimes the practice is just simply noticing the moment that we're already in. The warm cup of coffee, a quiet walk on a beautiful day, a conversation with someone we care about. Those small experiences that often pass by unnoticed when the mind is busy chasing the next milestone. Another helpful practice is learning to let the emotions move through us without trying to immediately fix them. So when that frustration arises, instead of assuming something has gone wrong, we can remember that emotions are temporary waves. They rise, they move, they settle, and they dissolve. Often the most helpful response isn't eliminating the feeling, but allowing it to pass while we're continuing to do what matters to us. And this connects to something deeply emphasized in acceptance and commitment therapy. Living well is less about feeling good all the time and more about acting in alignment with our values, showing up for the things that matter to us, relationships, meaningful work, creativity, contribution, even when the emotional weather isn't perfect. Because interestingly, many people discover that fulfillment often emerges not from chasing happiness, but from engaging with life fully as it is. So perhaps a happiness myth isn't that happiness exists, but that it's supposed to stay with us. That life will eventually arrive at some pressure-free moment where everything finally settles for us. But when we look closely at the psychology and the neuroscience of being human, we see that happiness was never meant to be a permanent destination. It's something quieter than that, something that appears in the ordinary moments, moments when we're present, moments when we engage with what matters, and moments when we participate in our lives rather than waiting for them to begin. As Viktor Frankl once wrote, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. And perhaps that space is where a different kind of happiness lives for us. Not the kind we chase, but the kind that emerges when we meet life as it is unfolding. So wherever you're listening from today, maybe the invitation isn't to wait for life to calm down before you finally allow yourself to feel good. Maybe it's simply to notice the moment you're already in, here and now. Your breath moving in and out. The ordinary details of the day. The life that is unfolding for you right now. Because sometimes a good part of life isn't waiting somewhere ahead. Sometimes it's already happening